Hello viewers, thank you for joining me. Here we are at last. I don't want to brand Babylon with the notoriety of being the show that broke me, because my break from this channel's usual schedule was primarily the culmination of a bunch of shit in my real life finally starting to overwhelm me. But I guess I can't pretend it didn't also play its part. This was a much more complicated anime than I realized I was signing on for when I first started it. And this will sound like a pun in a minute, but if I was going to review this show, I wanted to feel like I was doing it justice. I didn't want to rush the process of organizing my thoughts. And this series had a bit of an added challenge on that front. As you can see from the title, this review will also include reflections on 3 other shows I've already watched and reviewed for this channel. I don't normally like my reviews to rely too heavily on comparisons to other shows, but at various points throughout these 12 episodes, Babylon reminded me so strongly of these other anime that I don't feel like I can accurately portray my experience with it without going into those comparisons. I'll warn you now that there will most likely be spoilers for all 4 shows, and I almost forgot the second warning, but please be advised that the issue at the heart of this anime is suicide, so we'll be talking about it a lot. Babylon takes place in the recently developed city of Shiniki, a sector of Tokyo that was designed to operate as an independent entity. Shiniki's about to hold an election for its first mayor, which will become very important very soon. But in the meantime, we're introduced to the city's head prosecutor, a man named Zen Seizaki. Seizaki is a little uptight, but primarily because he's very passionate about his job. He's not the bright-eyed rookie in the office anymore, but he's held on to his ideals about being the one to uphold justice in their society, protecting the peace and making the world a better place and all that. His name literally means goodness and justice, and he has a conversation with pretty much every important character we meet about what those things mean to them as an individual. When the story opens, he's working a fraud case. A pharmaceutical company paid off a bunch of laboratories to falsify their experiment data, make the drug seem more effective than it actually is. But while going through the boxes of evidence they seized, they find a blood-soaked document about a different drug, and when they go to track down the doctor in charge of those experiments, they find him dead in his home, supposedly of suicide, but there's something strange about the circumstances. The team ultimately uncovers 2 things. The drug was being marketed as a sleeping pill, but contained such high doses of the medicine that it's basically guaranteed to kill whoever takes it. It's a death drug. And the other big reveal is that they're able to link the experiments to the man favored to win the upcoming election, a popular, lifelong politician named Ryuichiro Nomaru. But then we meet with Nomaru, and the situation continues to grow more complicated. For one, Shiniki isn't just a regular old city. It was basically designed to be a sovereign state, capable of making and enforcing its own laws, a much bigger experiment than the public was led to believe. Nomaru calls it a testing ground for nations, a place where they can try out new, potentially controversial laws to prove they can work before trying to introduce them on a bigger scale. The election is rigged, but not in his favor. The powers behind the scenes have fixed it so that Kaika Itsuki, the charismatic youngest candidate in the running, will be chosen as mayor, a new face for a new world. Nomaru proudly depicts Itsuki as his protege, but as soon as he's elected, the plan quickly starts to derail, as Itsuki takes the power and runs with it, revealing his own agenda. The first law he introduces is the right to die, at any time, seemingly for any reason at all, and this announcement is punctuated by a demonstration where 60 people jump from the roof of the city's tallest building, appearing nothing short of delighted to be hurtling toward their own deaths. The strangeness of that brings us to another major player in this tale, a woman Itsuki's been working with named Ai Magase, a master of disguise and manipulation. At first, they were looking into her as part of some sort of prostitution scheme designed to help rig the election, but she's soon revealed to be something much more dangerous. Just a few seconds of direct contact with her can leave a previously happy, sane, well-adjusted person ready to willingly jump to their own death. She's basically the human personification of the call of the abyss. As the weeks pass and the death toll continues to rise, it becomes increasingly clear that Itsuki and Magase need to be stopped. But as we've already discussed, Seizaki values justice and protecting people above all else. He's not the type to be intimidated just because their target is a powerful politician. I found Zen Seizaki to be a pleasant surprise of a character on multiple levels. There was something almost innocent about his outlook and ideals that softened out the cold exterior you usually see. It's just occurring to me now that we never actually get to see him in a courtroom, but it's not at all hard to picture why he's been so successful. I'm sure he made a very compelling lawyer. Along those lines, I guess I expected him to be more of a prickly, lone wolf type of character. But as the task force is put together to catch and build a case against these two, it's really highlighted that he not only has friends and good relationships with all the departments he has to work with, but he's accepting of newcomers and outside help. As long as they're all working towards the same goal, he seems like a pretty easy guy to work with. There are no clashing egos on this team, which was kind of refreshing. Unfortunately, as the series went on, I realized I might have just jumped the gun a little. Zen, as we meet him, isn't the lone wolf who keeps everyone at a distance, traumatized by past cases. But Babylon is the story of the case that turns him into that kind of person. It quickly becomes an obsession for Seizaki. I mentioned that he wasn't the resident bright-eyed rookie either, but his assistant was. Fumio was still finding his footing as a prosecutor, but he really looked up to Zen and was excited about being involved in a big case with political implications, feeling like they were working on something that was really going to make a difference. Fumio tracks Ai to her apartment, rushes in to talk to her himself, and not an hour later, Seizaki receives a texted suicide note and finds him dead, thus sealing his own fate, because it's impossible for Seizaki to move on now without getting justice for Fumio, someone no one believes was secretly at the breaking point before meeting with Ai. And the more people we lose as Ai continues to evade them just increases that feeling of responsibility, of needing to be the one to stop her and uncover her secrets. We're about to get into the comparisons section, and I can see them very quickly snowballing into each other, so I'll remind you again about possible spoilers. And here we go. The first anime Babylon reminded me of was Death Note, though this comparison is a little more vague than the others. On the off chance that I wasn't the last person in the world to finally see it, like 5 years ago, Death Note is the tale of Light Yagami, an exceptionally bright high school student who's secretly unsatisfied with his seemingly perfect life. One day, he comes across a notebook that a death god dropped into the living world by accident, which allows him to kill anyone he wants simply by writing down their name and picturing them in his mind. There is some very brief talk about making the world a better place, which is quickly overtaken by Light's ego, as he decides the best place this world could possibly be is the version where he uses the Death Note to rule over it like a god. I think Death Note is one of those anime that's always going to have a space in my mind, in part because it was insanely popular, so it's just a little inescapable as an anime fan, but primarily because I didn't enjoy it as much as I wanted to. It does hold a really interesting place in the realm of storytelling, because I feel like there are very few tales where your main character is genuinely the villain that you're not meant to be rooting for. That was honestly the biggest roadblock towards enjoyment for that show for me. They really give you nothing that can redeem Light. Like, what could possibly be compelling this kid to tear down the world except the need to satisfy his own ego? I feel like there are two ways you can interpret Death Note. It's either this grand commentary on what happens when one person is given too much power, a cautionary tale of sorts, or it's a self-indulgent power fantasy that allows you to live vicariously through Light, until his final, very satisfying end, that is. Light's worst character flaw is his arrogance. He's convinced he knows better than everyone else. There's kind of an interesting comparison to make between Light and Zen on that front, because Seizaki is also trying to dictate how others live their lives, to an extent. He's working to restrict the choice Itsuki is trying to offer the world. But it's a very hypothetical, surface-level discussion, because there are a lot of issues with how Babylon tackles suicide, but we'll get into that. To be honest, the part of the story that really made me call back to Death Note was the cat-and-mouse detective element with the task force trying to catch Itsuki and Ai. That was by far my favorite part of Death Note, which we got a close-up, insider look at because Light's father was the chief of police. It's a much shorter part of Babylon's story, but both groups contain some really likable characters, and I love the teamwork element of it. Like I said, Death Note's left its mark. It's possible every good police-themed anime I see will bring me back to it from now on. But as Seizaki's task force is quickly dismantled, and honestly, as soon as our villain's true goal became established and Babylon became this big debate about free will, as soon as it became possible to argue that Itsuki may not be all wrong, I started comparing this show to a different anime. A lot of these series about good and evil and trying to find the line between the two just go hand in hand, right? While I don't think most people should have any trouble seeing Light as the villain, Terror in Resonance was a little more complicated. Like with centering your story around the idea that maybe suicide isn't necessarily a bad thing, it throws the big, emotional, attention-grabbing issue of terrorism right in your face from the very first episode. Terror in Resonance centers on a pair of teenage boys, going by the codenames 9 and 12, who steal a bunch of nuclear material out of a facility and use bombs to enact a series of terrorist attacks on Tokyo. But the cat-and-mouse detective struggle in this anime has a deeper purpose. You ultimately come to find out that the government was secretly experimenting on orphans, and 9 and 12 were two of those subjects. They're targeting buildings tied to important figures who were involved in the experiments, trying to get one detective in particular to figure it out, because they trust him to expose the corruption and hold the right people responsible. While Light was, maybe purposefully, not redeemed at all, I kind of felt like 9 and 12 were redeemed a little too well. Not just that they had sad enough backstories to make you sympathetic for them, the terrorism isn't quite what it seems. They go to serious lengths, occasionally even at risk to their own lives, to make sure no one is actually going to get hurt in their schemes. They're not the villains they're first made out to be, by any stretch of the definition. But I think that did make this show really successful in making me question something I would have thought I knew the answer to before getting into this series. With no loss of life, no serious danger to innocent lives, and a really good reason for doing the bad things they do, is the panic they cause and the destruction of property still inherently bad? Are there circumstances in which terrorism isn't inherently bad? I really recommend checking out Terror in Resonance if you haven't seen it. It was successful with its controversy in a way that Babylon, unfortunately, could only dream of. This sounds really cynical and negative, actually, but I almost don't want to assign one thing as Babylon's biggest flaw, because there's another point that was equally disappointing to me that we'll get into with the final comparison. But one of this anime's worst shortcomings is that, for the show that's all about suicide, it never managed to prove to me that it understood suicide on, like, a fundamental level. Because there are absolutely scenarios where I think people should have the right to end their life. The controversy around medical-assisted suicides in the cases of the terminally ill isn't a hypothetical, fictional issue. Itsuki presents another scenario that's more controversial, but which I could still see people supporting. As a parent, if your kid needs some organ transplanted that you can't live without, wouldn't most people willingly donate their own at the cost of their life if it meant saving their child? But they've already gone off the rails by the time they sit back and try to reasonably justify it. The way the writers approach suicide is just weird. Very little time is spent discussing the mental health aspect of it, or the obvious reason to push back against it, the harm it does to the loved ones you leave behind. They talk about suicide like the only reason people don't do it more often is because it's against the rules, basically, because you've been taught to believe it's inherently bad. It just comes across feeling like they're very out of touch with the issue they decided to center their whole story around. But maybe that's not too surprising, because I feel like we see very few true suicides throughout this story. Nearly every death we see has been engineered by Ai and this weird, superpowered influence she has. Which brings us to the other big thing, and the final comparison I found myself making. Monster is a complicated anime, but I'll try to keep this brief. It follows a neurosurgeon caught up in the messy politics of the hospital in Germany where he works. Dr. Tenma is another one who has strong feelings about justice and right and wrong. He clashes with the hospital director over the hospital's tendency to prioritize wealthier patients, and goes against orders one night to save a young boy who was brought in first over the political figure that they wanted him to drop everything for. A decision that will haunt him for the rest of his days as young Johann Liebert grows up to be a serial killer, obsessed with the man who saved his life. He pins his crimes on Tenma, who goes rogue to try and stop him and atone for the damage he unwittingly caused. Monster is a psychological masterpiece. It's pretty long and a little slow, I'll be the first to admit, but the payoff is so worth it. Tenma's journey to track down Johann takes us through the mystery of his childhood and slowly unravels what made him the way he is and why his mind works the way it does. They presented me with a character I thought would be just about impossible to redeem, and by the end, I found it impossible not to sympathize with him. Magase desperately needed the Johann treatment, and I was optimistic she was going to get it. They're talked about in very similar ways. They were both adopted out of mysterious circumstances, and everyone we encounter who has a history with them has a story to tell about how they're basically evil incarnate, and there was always just something inherently wrong with them. Unfortunately for Babylon, I never gets past that stage. It's all build-up, no payoff, and I hate that. At the very least, they could have confirmed she was practicing some kind of hypnotism on her victims. It makes her a weaker character that she's just this personification of evil, but it does kind of make sense for this story. I described Babylon as the show about suicide, but it always had an eye on being something much bigger. It takes a serious crack at defining good and evil, and I won't pretend it doesn't get a little convoluted and pretentious at times, but I actually do like what they come up with. That goodness is basically perseverance, the act of continuing on and trying to be good and do good for the world, kind of reflected in Seizaki's journey to determine what justice really means and how best to serve it. And by comparison, evil is anything that forces you to stop. As this debate is framed around whether countries should change their stance on suicide on a global level, I think this works. I don't think there was a concrete, perfect answer, but the one they give us is serviceable. And on that note, I think Babylon as a whole is okay. I realize that all these comparisons actually serve to paint it in a pretty negative light, highlighting its failures where other shows had succeeded, which hadn't consciously been my intention when I set out to make this review this way. For a 12-episode series, I think Babylon attempted something very ambitious. It was maybe a little in over its head. It definitely didn't succeed on every front, but I don't view it as this total train wreck of an anime either. For the most part, I enjoyed watching it, which definitely counts for something. I do want to say, the way this review shaped up, I opted not to get into the big detailed spoilers that I thought I was going to when I started this, which is leaving me feeling like I kind of missed a big point that I wanted to make that I'm gonna try to patch in at the end here as smoothly as possible. I think this show's take on the big picture question of defining good and evil was kind of a, they did their best, it's acceptable kind of outcome, but the slightly smaller scale version of that, defining good and evil, and in turn justice for Zen Seizaki on a more personal level, I really liked how that storyline played out. It's kind of doing a lot of heavy lifting and redeeming a show I feel like I've otherwise really only had criticisms for. So if I sound a little wishy-washy near the end here, I didn't mean to give anyone the impression this show was hot garbage from start to finish. There were certain aspects of the story that it did really well. And I generally recommend seeing for yourself any show that makes you think, and Babylon works pretty hard on that front. And if you did find it a little disappointing, at least I can say I've pointed you in the direction of some series that might scratch that itch a little better. Thank you all again for your patience with this one, and thank you for watching.